I'm Stavros Niarchos, the co-director of the Hellenic Studies program here at Yale. And I would like to welcome Michael Dukakis, who is the speaker tonight for the annual Stavros Niarchos Foundation Lecture, which is our main event. We're very pleased to have him tonight. And we're also very grateful to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for funding this lecture and also funding our program. And I would like to call Mr. Vasilis Tsamis to say a few words on behalf of the foundation, and then I'll come back and present the governor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kalivas. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight here. It's a particular privilege and honor. I was born and raised in Greece, so the connectivity is immediate and serious. I'm representing here the Stavros Niarchos Foundation as the Chief Operating Officer. The Stavros Niarchos, and I'm a numbers guy, so it's established 22 years ago. Have given over $2.5 billion in some 125 countries around the world with some 5,000 grants. The Yale relationship is going back to 16 years, if not more. It is a very meaningful, multifaceted relationship in the School of Art, in the Hellenic Studies, in the School of Medicine, the School of Public Affairs, and we are delighted to continue supporting in any way we can, as we do always in arts and culture, education, social welfare, health, medicine, and sports, which is a broad mandate for our foundation that we are proud to continue. Our founder has given us particular direction to give at least half of what we give towards Greek causes, and we are proud to continue that. We have offices around the world that would do this effectively. We have gone through some difficult times in Greece, as you all know. We had some very severe headwinds. When there was nothing that could be done, they told us we had something to do, we thought. So we supported through humanitarian support with 3 waves of 300 million euros each. Very many causes, the immediate needs that the country had. And we thought that we'll give a small light of hope in the abyss and darkness of the reality in Greece by building a cultural center, an educational center, a recreational center in Athens. It was a large project of over $800 million that we delivered to the Greek state, and we are delighted that over 1 million people had visited already in the first year of operations. Having that in mind, I don't want to hold you back from the excellent speaker that we have, so I will ask Dr. Kalivas to come back. I thank you very much for your hospitality.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your continuing support. So it's a great pleasure and honor for us to welcome Michael Dukakis here at Yale for this annual lecture. Governor Dukakis is presently a colleague of sorts. He's a professor of political science at Northeastern University, so I'm very pleased by that. But of course, he's very widely known for his political career. That spans a very, very long time. In a way, one can say he's a living history of American politics of the last 40 years. Michael Stanley Dukakis was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. Both of his parents were immigrants from Greece, and he grew up in Boston. He studied at Swarthmore College and then went to Harvard Law School. And after serving in the military, in the US military, he began very early on a stellar political career. He started in 1970. He started initially, in fact, in the 1960s, serving in local positions. And then in 1970, he was nominated as the Massachusetts, he was the nominee for the Massachusetts Democratic Party for the position of lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. He didn't win that election. There's a very interesting non-linear political career. But then he came back in 1978. In 1974, he was elected as a governor. He was defeated after the end of his first term. He had to serve under very adverse economic conditions. But then after being away for 4 years, he was elected, and then he was elected again for a second term. So altogether, he served as 3-term governor of Massachusetts with this interruption in the middle. However, the reason he's nationally known in the United States is because in 1988, he was nominated by the Democratic Party to be the candidate of the party in the presidential election of that year. He faced George Bush, the senior, and he was defeated in that election. But it's really his participation in that election that brought him national attention. After that, he finished his service as governor of Massachusetts and decided not to go back into active politics. His career since then spans both academic work and policy work. He's been a faculty at Northeastern University in Boston, as I said, in political science. And he has also served in various positions in policy, including most notably on the board of directors of Amtrak, which is very interesting. And he has been also an observer and commentator of American politics, trying to understand the various developments in that area. And that's precisely what he's going to talk to us about tonight. I'd like to highlight, by way of connecting myself to him, 2 moments and 2 memories which come together in the summer of 1988. This was when, having won a Fulbright scholarship as an undergraduate in Greece, I came to study in the United States. I was accepted at the University of Chicago as a PhD student. I had never been in the United States before. That was my first time. And Fulbright actually sent me to California at the University of California, Davis, for an orientation program. So I arrived in Sacramento, never having been in the United States before. And of course, that was the summer of 1988 presidential campaign. I remember that campaign very, very vividly because it was the first major political event I witnessed in the United States. And one of the things that I remember at the time, which was quite shocking, was the extent to which Michael Dukakis had to face a very negative campaign from the Republican side. In hindsight, we know that that was the beginning of a turn in American politics in which what we may describe as nasty, polarizing political campaigning gained a lot of traction, and the fact that it was successful, that it worked for the Republicans at the time, certainly gave that new mix of policy, of political strategies, a lot of traction in American politics for worse. However, the thing that is really striking, of course, is when we look back at those times, what appears to have been extremely negative and very nasty pales in comparison to what we're experiencing today. And I would be very interested to hear Governor Dukakis' thoughts about that evolution, its causes, potential consequences. The second thing that I would like to mention is that for me, arriving in the United States for the first time at that particular juncture, I remember very vividly every time I was interacting with an American, they would ask me where I'm from. I would say from Greece, and then they would say Michael Dukakis. And for me, that was an incredibly welcoming reaction for a variety of reasons. First of all, because I felt that being Greek was not something trivial. In fact, a person from my homeland was presidential candidate, potentially the next president of the United States. The second thing was that it gave me the feeling that this was a country that could turn the son of immigrants into a president, and therefore it gave me a sense that this could be a home, this was a welcoming country, a diverse country that gave a lot of opportunities to the people who came to their shore, to its shore. And so I'm very grateful and very glad after 30 years, that was in 1988, to take this opportunity to thank you for making me so welcome when I arrived for the first time in the United States. So I'm very happy to welcome you tonight here for this annual lecture. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so very much. This will be less a lecture and more, I hope, an informal and interesting discussion, which is why the way I try to teach anyway. So I couldn't deliver a lecture from a script if I tried. But I'm glad that I made you welcome, even if I wasn't conscious about it. The support I got from the Greek community during that election was extraordinary, and some of you are here, and I'm very grateful to all of you who were part of this. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to say anything definitive tonight about how we try to deal with our problems in a bipartisan way. But it's very interesting. I just had my 84th birthday. I feel like $1 million, and my dear mother, who came here at the age of 9 with her family and settled in Haverhill, Massachusetts, shoe town in those days, and so far as we can determine was the first Greek young woman ever to go away to college unescorted in the history of the United States. It never happened before. Thanks to an elementary school principal named Stanley Gray. If you want to know why my middle name is Stanley and not my father's, which is the Greek tradition, as most of you know, it's because my mother wanted one of her sons to carry that name. And he became a second father to her. Her father was a guy who had great respect for educators. And Mr. Gray was a very, very important person in the family life. And so this little Greek girl not only finished high school, itself unusual, but went away to Bates College unescorted. Never had happened before, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1925. She was born and grew up in Larissa. My dad, whose people were from Mytilene, from Lesbos, actually grew up in a predominantly Greek town in western Turkey. It was called Adramiti, the Greeks called it Adramiti, the Turks called it Edremit. It's a town of about 12,000, 75% Greek at the time. And he was born in 1896. And when he was 15 in 1912, and I don't know if this had anything to do with the Young Turk movement, which was obviously beginning to become very important in Turkey. But at the age of 15, he decided he wanted to come to the United States to get an education. Now, as many of you know, in those days, young Greeks didn't come here to get an education for the most part. They came here to get a job. But this 15-year-old decided he wanted to come here and get an education. He had two brothers who were working in the textile mills in Lowell and Lawrence. Didn't speak a word of English, didn't have a nickel in his pocket. And 12 years later, as you've just heard, my dad graduated from Harvard Medical School. How he did it, I have no idea, folks. Worked in the mills, worked in restaurants, went to night school, went to Boston University for a year, itself very unusual, and met another Greek, a guy named Zarifis, who somehow convinced him that the two of them ought to become doctors. In those days, all you needed was 2 years of pre-medical. And somehow they ended up at Bates. Now, this is long before my mother was there. It had no connection to do 1 year of pre-medical. He did all their science stuff. And he wanted to go to Harvard Medical School. And he was put on the waiting list. He was very, very disappointed. And he ended up at Dartmouth, which in those days was a 2-year medical school from which you transferred to some other medical school. And with a very heavy heart, he went up to Hanover. They showed him his room, said this was Daniel Webster's room. My father, I'm not sure if he knew who Daniel Webster was in any event. He didn't care. And a week later, he got a telegram from his mother, family had settled in Lowell, saying, come home, Harvard Medical has admitted you. Did 4 years of medical school, internships, residencies, and practiced medicine for 52 years at 454 Huntington Avenue, for those of you who are familiar with the geography of Boston, right across from the Museum of Fine Arts. Interestingly enough, that apartment building, as it was at that time, and where my parents spent the first 3 years of their married life, is now Burstein Hall at Northeastern University, where I've been teaching for 26 years. So when people say to me, "Πού είστε?" in Greece, I say, είμαι Μυτινινιός, είμαι Μικρασιάτης, είμαι Λαρισαίος, και είμαι Υπηρώτης, because my maternal grandparents came from a little village called Visohori in Epirus. And then the folks in Corfu decided to make me an honorary citizen. So I added a fifth. Τώρα είμαι Κορφιώτης. But it's a great heritage. Thanks to my yaya on my father's side, who didn't speak a word of English and lived with us for the first 7 years of my life. I grew up bilingual. You know, I speak pretty good 7-year-old Greek. But as I said to the folks when we were meeting, when I go to Greece, and Kitty and I try to go there once every 3 years or so, and they put me on television, I say to them, τα ελληνικά μου είναι πολύ απλά και δεν έχω λεξιλόγιο των πολιτικών καθόλου. So they have to put me in English with subtitles. So that it is. Fortunately, I fell in love with a wonderful woman who's with us tonight, and in her own right has done extraordinary advocacy, particularly in the field of mental health and refugees and immigrants, worked as a social worker professionally with refugees and immigrants. And I always introduce her as the best-looking Medicare recipient in America, which she is, but she's here with us tonight. Kitty Dukakis, everybody. She's about to have her 81st birthday, so we're going to have a big celebration. Kitty was born the day after Christmas, which was always a difficult thing, and now we celebrate Christmas with our son and his family in Boston. And our daughters are in Denver and San Francisco, and each have a couple of kids, so they swap birthday celebrations. And then we drag ourselves off to UCLA for the winter quarter. It's a terrible burden, but somebody's got to do it. And we've had a really remarkable thing. And they are just beginning a Hellenic Studies program there. And I hope I'm going to be, at least in my 3 months, involved with that. So what you folks have done here really is a model for us. And the Greek community in Los Angeles is very enthusiastic about the new Hellenic Studies program at UCLA. They've been very generous and very supportive, and we're looking forward to it. So what about bipartisanship? Was America a kind of center of bipartisanship over the course of its political career? The answer to that question is absolutely not. Yeah, that campaign in '88, where I should have done a much better job of dealing with that attack campaign that I did, was pretty nasty. And I did a terrible job of responding to it. And I had been through some very tough negative campaigns in my gubernatorial races, so it wasn't as if this was a new phenomenon here. But I made what turned out to be a pretty dumb decision, and that was that I was not going to respond to the attack campaign. And one of my closest colleagues among the nation's governors was Mario Cuomo, a guy I admired enormously. And when we were talking about the race initially, he said, look, forget about it. Don't worry about this attack stuff. Just ignore it. It's not going to affect anything. We were campaigning together 4 days before the election in November of '88 in Queens. And he turned to me and said, it's the worst advice I ever gave you. But I responded to it because I think, like Mario, we're positive people. We're not interested in acting like a couple of kids in a sandbox throwing sand at each other. It just turned out to be the wrong strategy. Bush was very vulnerable. The most liberal furlough program in America was the Reagan-Bush furlough program in the federal prison system. They were furloughing people for 45 days. One of their furloughees went out and murdered a young pregnant mother in the Southwest, all that kind of stuff. I never said that. Well, you don't respond to that kind of stuff, folks. It's going to take its toll. So I apologize to all of you. I used to say if I'd beaten Bush 1, you'd never heard of Bush 2. Because I thought Bush 2 was the worst president I'd ever lived under until this guy came along. More on that later. And it is not true that the United States has been a haven of bipartisan politics. The politics of this country, immediately after the Declaration of Independence and the ratification of the Constitution were brutal. And even the press made no pretense at being objective. In fact, when Jefferson left the presidency after 8 years, he said something about finally being able to get the jackals of the press off his back, or words to that effect. It was brutal. It was very tough. Every once in a while these days, people say to me, well, have you ever seen it this bad? And I say to them, did you see the movie Lincoln? I mean, that was bad. American politics have been rough and in many cases quite partisan. And we've gone through some very, very difficult periods. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what happened in this country right after World War I. When we had domestic terrorism far in excess of anything that we've ever experienced in this country. What was going on? Any of you know what was going on at that time? Especially in major northeastern cities? Terrorists, many of them anarchists, were blowing up cities regularly. In fact, one of them blew up the home of the Attorney General, this guy Palmer, who subsequently launched the so-called Palmer raids and was a graduate of Swarthmore College. Can you believe it? A graduate of a Quaker institution being involved in this kind of thing. And in point of fact, Sacco and Vanzetti went to the electric chair, folks, not because they committed that crime, they didn't, but because they were Italian immigrants and they happened to be anarchists. Now, they weren't violent anarchists. They had never engaged in any violent activity. But there isn't any question that those folks were convicted because they were Southern Europeans, Italians, and so on and so forth. And those Palmer raids were a response to regular terrorist attacks in major American cities, especially east of the Mississippi. I'm trying to think of maybe a time or two when the United States was a haven for bipartisan activity, and there's no question that we've had some of those situations, but I was at Swarthmore from 1951 to 1955. That's when a guy named Joseph R. McCarthy was doing his thing. It was a terrible time, folks. And McCarthy had his supporters. So I'm at Swarthmore. I'm this Greek kid at a Quaker college. I had never been out of New England. I didn't know a Quaker from a Shaker. I had no idea what this was all about. But I knew it was a pretty good school, and I wanted to get out of New England. And I had thought about going to Bates. My brother was there, but he said, you know, you like cities. So why don't you take a look at Swarthmore? I said, isn't that a girls' school? He said, no, that's Skidmore. I mean, that's how much we knew. But these were 4 very important years for me. And I got quite active politically. And within 6 weeks after I graduated in 1955, I was drafted into the United States Army and showed up at the Fargo building in Boston with 30 other characters, and we got on a train and we went to Fort Dix, New Jersey for our first 8 weeks of basic training. 3 days after we got there, we had what passed for a personnel interview. 5 minutes in front of another draftee who was a personnel specialist, so-called, who decided what you were going to do for the next 2 years. Except my guy had a file on me. This is in pre-computer America. With every single political activity I'd ever engaged in at Swarthmore College. So the interview went something like this. So I see you ran a fundraising drive for the American Civil Liberties Union while you were on the Swarthmore campus. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. And you were the chairman of the Students for Democratic Action, which was the student wing of the ADA, the Liberal Democratic Organization. By the way, I was succeeded in that capacity at Swarthmore by a guy named Carl Levin, who just finished 18 years in the United States Senate from Michigan. I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I was. And we went through this thing. Now, I was a little concerned, folks, because I knew people who had been drafted and they'd been held for months, and in some cases discharged dishonorably, or other than honorably, because of some organization that they had joined when they were in high school. One of them happened to be a dear friend of mine who had joined something called the United World Federalists. It wasn't left, it wasn't right. It was basically for a strong UN. And that guy spent 3 or 4 months before his father was able to get a hold of Paul Douglas and Dick Neuberger, and both United States senators who managed to make it possible for him to serve the military, and then went to medical school and has been a doctor at a community health center for many years in Boston. And I'm not sure I decided at the time I wanted to go into politics professionally, but it was kind of the back of my head. And I wasn't interested in starting my political career with another than honorable discharge, needless to say. Anyway, fortunately, the guy didn't recommend that and sent me to Korea, which was okay. How do you think the government got that information on this Greek kid from Boston who had just spent 4 years at a small college outside of Philadelphia? 10 years later, we discovered that the FBI had a tap on the Swarthmore switchboard and was recording every single phone call that went through that switchboard, and apparently had somebody that you and I were paying taking notes to come up with files on that kind. It was a terrible, terrible period, folks. And there were no neutrals. You were either pro-McCarthy or anti-McCarthy. Vietnam was worse. There are at least some of you old enough to remember during that period. It was, families were divided. Friends were divided. There was nothing bipartisan about that war. So we've been here before. Now, the fact that we have somebody in the White House who's charitably, a little strange, obviously colors this. And when I was at Swarthmore, I don't know how many political scientists we have in the room, there was a guy at Wesleyan named Schatzschneider. Any folks who remember Schatzschneider? Does that name mean anything to any of you? One person in the back. 1, 2, yeah. Schatzschneider was arguing that the United States and its politics weren't partisan enough. You had liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats in the South who pretty much controlled the Congress as a result of their seniority. And they never voted together. You had conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. A lot of them, especially in the Northeast. Folks that I worked with very closely, good people, shared the same values and so on and so forth. But what did it mean to be a Republican? What did it mean to be a Democrat when you had conservatives and liberals in the same party? Schatzschneider argued very forcefully that it was time to turn the parties into organizations that stood for something. And we did it. And now we're very upset. But Schatzschneider's thesis, it was called the Schatzschneider thesis, was what? That what's the point of going in and voting Democratic or Republican if you don't know what's going to happen when it's all over? And remember, the conservative Democrats were largely from the South and blatantly segregationist and racist. And one of the great partisan battles in this country was the Civil Rights Revolution, in which we finally decided that, at least we hope we decided, that the color of somebody's skin was not something that ought to put that person in a horribly inferior position. And we're still working at it, even as this country gets browner and browner. And apparently that's bothering some folks, because Charlottesville, I don't think we should take it overly seriously, but Charlottesville was a reflection of the fact that there are people out there who apparently have very, very, in my opinion, dangerous and biased opinions, and they're obviously reflected to some extent in this guy that's currently in the White House. All this by way of background. We've gone through lots and lots of partisan battles in this country. The question is, what do we do about it now? And the short answer to it, as far as I'm concerned, is I'm not sure. Now, at the state and local level, at least in my experience, there's much less partisanship. It's partisan, and there are ideological differences. But there must be some reason why the nation's mayors, most of them Democrats but some Republicans, seem to come together around a common agenda. And I think it's because they're all facing the same kinds of problems. some of my closest colleagues in the National Governors Association, Dan Evans from Washington, who taught me a lot as a rookie governor. Thoughtful, progressive, and more than willing to reach out to us young guys that just showed up in the organization, and extremely helpful. There was, at the time, a new generation of young, white Democratic governors in the South who were pro-civil rights. And let me tell you, folks, that took a lot of guts. Who were they? Well, it started with a guy named Bill Winter in Mississippi, a remarkable guy, still going strong at 93. And then there were guys like Clinton, Bob Graham in Florida, Dick Riley, who I just talked to the other day in South Carolina, a wonderful guy, Lamar Alexander, a Republican, who were pro-civil rights and got themselves elected in the South. But that whole struggle, which continues, was not fun, folks. And in point of fact, the Civil Rights Revolution itself, in many cases, was violent. People lost their lives, and the politics around race were brutal. So what do we do about this? Well, here's what I teach my kids at Northeastern these days. And I spend a lot of time talking about how you try to build consensus in politics and get things done. Because you can't get things done in politics without building consensus. It took me 20 years to figure that out, and a defeat for re-election the first time to kind of wake up to this. First, not only does defeat sober you a little bit, but it makes you a much better listener. I was a pretty good talker when I went into politics. I wasn't a very good listener. And after being defeated for re-election that first time, I started listening to people more. And I discovered two things. First, listening is less tiring than talking. And secondly, you learn stuff. And after about 20 years at this business, I finally began to get the hang of it. So what do I teach my students these days about trying to build consensus? First, that you go out and identify all of the key people. I hate this word stakeholder because nobody knows what it means, but I call them key players. And you bring them together in the form of a working group. Now, you've got to keep it reasonably sized. A working group of whom? Of people interested in the issue, many of whom can't stand each other's guts when the process begins. And it's remarkable what happens, folks, when you bring people together, especially if you're a prominent office holder, sit them down with good staff who understands how to do this, and begin to go to work and see if you can identify agreement around common problems. And I want to talk about this in the context of healthcare in this country, which has been occupying us for a long time. We're the only advanced industrialized nation in the world that does not provide comprehensive health care for all of its people. And as you can see from this, I'll get to the tax bill in a second, which I think is the most unbelievable piece of legislation I've ever seen in my life, and seeks to weaken the Affordable Care Act again. If you go out and take a poll tomorrow among the American people and ask them, should working Americans and their families have decent, affordable health care, what do you think the numbers look like? 93% say yes, and the other 7 haven't thought about it. I'm serious. I'm serious. And the vast majority of uninsured people in this country are working or members of working families. They're not loafing, they're not sitting around, they're not on public assistance. If you're on welfare, you get Medicaid. These are working Americans, no health care. And when they get so sick that they can't stand up, they end up in the emergency room, and we're all paying for it in the form of increased premiums and increased taxes. 93% say yes. Now, I was a fan of Barack Obama's, although I'll talk a little bit about the foreign policy side of this bipartisanship. And he worked very hard in this. But he never really, in this case, delivered a message, which I think, and as a guy that put a universal health care bill through his state legislature, did constantly, talking about working Americans and their families not having decent, affordable health care. Americans like people who work. And they're appalled by the notion that working Americans and their families can't have decent, affordable health care. So there's very broad agreement across this country about that. And so the interesting question is, why has it become so partisan an issue? I'm not going to criticize the former president who got elected twice. I couldn't even get elected once. I got a lot of respect for him, politically and otherwise. But I do think that message, hey, this is about working Americans. This is about working Americans and their families. Would have resonated more than we're going to get rid of pre-existing conditions and you can keep your kids on the policy until they're 26. It seemed to me that was the central message, which, by the way, neither the administration nor the Democrats in Congress seemed to focus on. And I finally got so upset at one point that I called the White House. I don't do this very often. Of course, these days I don't do it at all, but back in those days. And I talked to the young woman who was handling press on the health care bill. And I said to her, hey, look, I've got great respect for your boss. I mean, he got elected twice. I couldn't even get elected once. But I did put a universal health care bill through my legislature. And I said, it must have had 200 press events, and there was always a working person or working family next to me at that podium talking about what it was like to try to live and work and support yourself and your family without decent health insurance. And she said to me, what's your source for that? I said, 85% of the uninsured people in this country are working members of working families. She said, what's your source for that? I said, it's the Census Bureau. It works for your boss. So about 2 days later, President Obama mentioned working people for the first time in a discussion of health care. And she called me and said, did you see what the president said? I said, yeah, but he's got to say it 20 times a day, and so does the Congress. Didn't happen. Could we have gotten bipartisan support of a health care bill that emphasized the importance of providing health care to working folks and their families? Don't know. Don't know, but that wasn't the central theme, unfortunately. And message is important, folks. That's another lesson you learn from getting your head handed to you in your first run for re-election. I don't know, folks, at this point that it's possible to somehow get back to that day when we had, notwithstanding Professor Schatzschneider, liberal or progressive or whatever you want to call them, moderate Republicans and Democrats who managed to get some stuff done. Could Medicare today pass this Congress? I doubt it very much. I doubt it very much. This tax bill, I'm sorry, I'm the son of Greek immigrants. If I heard the words ekonomia Michali once, I heard them 1,000 times. The Greeks waste nothing, right? We're thrifty. We economize. Does anybody know what the current U.S. budget deficit is just this year? What is it? $700 billion, and we're close to full employment. There are better economists in this room than I am. I'm not an economist. But I'm sorry, we're close to full employment. By this time, we ought to have a surplus. A guy named Clinton, you remember him, in his last State of the Union address, proposed a plan which he said, credibly, would reduce and eliminate the national debt in 10 to 12 years. That was at a time when we had a surplus of $250 billion. First time that had happened in 50 years, under a Democratic administration. And the Republicans at the time in Congress wanted a tax cut. We had full employment in those days. And I think the economists in this room will agree that you don't cut taxes when you have full employment. You've got to start worrying about inflation and a few other things. And when the pollsters went out and asked the American people, this was in the year 2000, whether they were for the president's plan or they wanted a tax cut, they said, forget about the tax cut. By 2 to 1, do what the president's talking about. What was he talking about? Putting money away for Social Security, 2035, anticipating contingencies, doing the kinds of stuff that responsible people tend to do under these circumstances. Why are we talking about any tax cut when we have a budget deficit of $700 billion and we're close to full employment? This is absolutely insane, folks. I'm sorry. I mean, forget about the bill itself, which is, you know, back to giving tax cuts to the wealthy and trickle-down economics. Didn't work the first time, we're going to try it again. But I'm sorry. I mean, how do you, if you're, and frankly, I'm not hearing a lot about the budget deficit from the Democrats. They don't like the tax cut. They think it ought to be for the middle class. I'm sorry. You know, most of us are middle class. There's no room at this point, in my judgment, in American economic policy for a tax cut for the middle class. We've got to get this budget deficit eliminated and start running some surpluses if we're at full employment. Otherwise, sorry to say this, we're going to start looking more like Greece and its troubles. I mean, this budget, this bill is going to give us an operating deficit of $1.5 trillion. Any of you know what we're spending on debt service right now every year just to pay the interest on $20 trillion in debt? Remember, the Clinton plan would have eliminated it. In fact, at the time, Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he wasn't against it, but he was troubled. He said, well, if you don't have some debt, how can the Fed work? So Clinton said, we'll give you, you know, $500 billion in debt so you can do your thing. What are we spending just to service the national debt? Every year. Anybody know? $500 billion, $500 billion just for interest on this debt that we piled up. You go to $1.5 trillion, folks, and about 1/3 of the federal budget is going to be paying interest. I think that's very bad policy. And I'm not sure how, given what appears to be now virtual unanimity on the part of the Republicans in the Senate and a substantial majority in the House, I don't know how you figure that one out on a bipartisan basis. I mean, should the Democrats have been talking more about fiscal responsibility, which unfortunately my party doesn't do as much as it should? Should we have been trying to explain to the American people that this is serious and very flawed economic policy? I'm not sure how one solves that problem on a bipartisan basis if 52 Republican senators now have kind of lined up for this. And this was the party which, to its credit, used to talk about fiscal responsibility until Dick Cheney came along and said, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. I'm here to tell you, I think deficits matter. It's not that you don't want to run them from time to time, especially if you're in deep trouble economically. But if you have $1.5 trillion debt, folks, and we go into another recession, you tell me where we're going to find the resources to get out of that one. I mean, this is just crazy. So, what's the answer to all of this? You look for at least some issues where you can find common ground. I may be an optimist. I am an optimist. You can't be in politics and be a pessimist. If you don't think that good people working together can make a difference in the lives of their fellow citizens, then don't go into politics. But I think there are some issues, and I think there was an opportunity there. Incidentally, you all know that Richard Nixon proposed a very good health care plan, right? Any of you? Anybody old enough to remember that, except me? It wasn't universal Medicare, but it was a comprehensive, universal plan in which employers and employees would have to contribute to health care at the workplace. All of them, without exception. 75% employer, 25% employee, with a somewhat expanded Medicaid program for people that were temporarily unemployed. That was the Nixon plan. If Ted Kennedy were here today, he'd tell you the worst political mistake he ever made was in not supporting that plan. Because with Kennedy's support and the support of labor and the liberals, it would have gone through Congress like a knife through butter. And it wasn't until they tried to get universal Medicare and couldn't that they finally decided to sit down with Nixon's people and a young assistant secretary named Stuart Altman, who's been teaching at Brandeis for many, many years, and came up with a plan which would have zipped through Congress except for something called Watergate. And once Watergate hit and Nixon's presidency was destroyed, that was the end of the Nixon plan. One state in the United States decided to pass a state version of the Nixon plan. What state was that? Not Massachusetts. That came later.
Hawaii.
State of Hawaii. Little Hawaii out there. I remember when Dan Quayle was asked about the Hawaiian health care plan. And, you know, like most folks in Washington, he had never heard of the Hawaiian health care plan. But it was a state version of the Nixon plan. And it's been operating in Hawaii since 1975. Virtually universal coverage. Some of the best health outcomes in America. In little Hawaii. Nobody knows about it. Nobody cares about it in Washington for reasons I don't understand. But the Nixon plan would have been an excellent health plan. And it would have covered everybody. And we wouldn't be going through this crazy debate. Could we get back to that? Would this Congress support the Nixon plan? No. Why not? Why not? Because it has an employer and an employee mandate. But you can't have universal health care, folks, unless all of us are required to contribute something. Now, when it comes to folks that are 65 and older, we're fortunate. In the 60s, we passed Medicare. Does it include a mandate? Of course it includes a mandate. You're paying a piece of your wage every time you get it for Social Security and Medicare, right? And employers have to do the same. Would Medicare go through this Congress? I kind of doubt it. Are there opportunities for bipartisan cooperation? Yes. But in some cases, and I want to conclude with this, that may be dangerous. I don't know how you folks feel about American foreign policy these days. I'm very upset about it. And I'm upset about it under both Republican and Democratic presidents. Because this country cannot be the world's policeman. With rare exceptions, our military interventions since World War II have been disastrous. And if we don't get serious about building an international framework for resolving international differences, and I'm serious about this. I'm not a romantic about the UN. I just think, you know, pathima mathima, right? One of my favorite Greek sayings, right? Things happen, you're supposed to learn from it. I don't see how you can look at what's happened since World War II and not conclude that this world of ours needs strong international organization in which the United States participates actively, and not just to deal with problems in North Korea, which were resolved toward the end of the Clinton administration, you know, with a plan that the North Koreans bought into before they had nukes, and unfortunately was essentially torpedoed by the Bush administration that followed. But to deal with climate change, I mean, the very existence of the planet, and other regional disputes that will flare up from time to time. So in that sense, this kind of bipartisan support for a U.S. role, which seems to me to be anything but a success these days, and in fact is causing more problems, not fewer, doesn't strike me as being a good bipartisan solution. I want to know where the people in my party are who are concerned about this. Or am I kind of an outlier who is in his old age getting crazy ideas? I don't think so, folks. I don't think so. So here's a place, not where we want people to be baldly partisan, but it's time for some debate over American foreign policy and American defense policy, which, among other things, is now in the process of spending $1 trillion to modernize our nuclear arsenal. And that was the product of the Obama administration. Now, of course, enthusiastically supported by the new guy in the White House. Maybe you think we ought to be spending $1 trillion to modernize our nuclear arsenal. I think we ought to be working our heads off to eliminate nuclear weapons. And in that respect, and on that issue, Henry Kissinger agrees with me. Anyway, lots of things going on out there. And I want to stop at this point and open up things for discussion, and feel free to be as critical as you want, because that's one of the things the Greeks brought to society, the idea of debate, discussion, so forth. But let me just say a word or two, if I can, quickly to the young people that are here. I'm a little concerned these days. I'm not seeing enough young Greek Americans getting actively involved in politics. There was a time several years ago when John Bradamus and Paul Sarbanes and myself and a bunch of others were doing things. And I hope inspiring young Greeks to go into it. I'm not seeing enough of that these days, folks. And let me say this to you. When Pericles talked about citizenship in Athens, and about the obligation of citizens to be deeply and actively involved in the political process, and when he criticized Athenians who were not doing that, that's a belief that I share and have been inspired by for a long time. There's nothing like being in public service and being in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens. And Kitty and I have had the great good fortune to be able to do that all of our lives. And with one exception, the fact that I never made it to the Lefkoiko. It's been an incredible ride, and we're still at it. My mother used to say that if you want to live a long life, pick your parents carefully. She lived till she was 100, and Kitty's dad was conducting the Boston Pops when he was 94. So we're planning to stick around for a while. But I want to see more and more and more young Greek Americans getting involved in politics. And I hope you'll do that. And if there's anything I can do to be helpful, just call on me, and I'm serious, because I'd like nothing more to be in a position where I can provide you with whatever guidance I can when it comes to this kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to stop at this point. We've got some time. Questions, comments, reactions, criticisms, fire away. Who's first? Who wants to start this discussion?
I'll start.
Go ahead.
If the 1988 election had been run in the social media era,
Yeah.
as opposed to now,
Yeah.
how different, if at all, do you think it would have been?
Well, it would have been worse. On the other hand, having experienced the social media and what it does and doesn't do, obviously we would have been ready for it and equipped to go at it. Now, having said that, there's a challenge here, folks, when you're running for office and somebody's coming at you with this stuff. And I had a very rough fight when I lost for re-election the first time and came back and won the second time. Those were not lovely, peaceful campaigns, either one of them. How do you blunt the attacks without turning yourself into an attacker, and in about 2 weeks people say, we're fed up with both of these guys? Now, I was able to do that successfully. Of course, we didn't have social media in 1982 when I ran against this guy King for the second time and beat him. But it wasn't a nice campaign. Fortunately for me, he had run a pretty sleazy administration. And he was coming at me because in my first term I had signed the biggest tax increase in Massachusetts history because the state was broke. I don't know who it was. I wasn't the genius that came up with this idea, but in any event, we came back at him by saying, well, he may not have raised your taxes, but you're paying a huge corruption tax as a result of this guy. And it seemed to work. And at the same time, people, I think, thought I was justified in doing that. But it's a fine line that you draw here between, you know, getting into the muck, so you're just as bad as the other guy, and trying to maintain some standards and some integrity while blunting these attacks. But to go back to your question, I mean, in this era, you got to be ready for that stuff all the time. All the time. Who's next? Yeah.
I'm question about the tax plan. You know, you talked about how horrible it is, and how, sorry, you talked about how horrible the tax plan is and not getting the message across, but the polling shows that the people don't like the tax plan.
Right.
They get it. It's the politicians who don't seem to care that we don't like it.
Well, some of them like it because they're voting for it, right? 52 of them, apparently.
The politicians like it, but the people...
Well, 52 politicians like them. Are they listening to their constituents? Has the Democratic Party done an effective job of explaining what's in this plan? I'm not sure we have. Have we pointed out to people that we're currently running a deficit of $700 billion? It's going to increase the national debt by another $700 billion. I'm not hearing that. Are you? I don't think people, nobody's talking about the national fiscal state of affairs here. Nobody. It's all a question of, as I said, it's all a question of what tax cut do you like? Democrats say, well, it ought to be for the middle class. Sorry, with all due respect, the middle class, we're all middle class, aren't we? Most of us. There's no room for a tax cut at this point. We've got to get that deficit out of there. And fast before we hit another recession and then have no fiscal flexibility. Look, one of the reasons we were able to get out of the Great Recession, folks, was because there was some fiscal flexibility there, although Bush had squandered the surplus and got us into a war that's going to cost us $3 trillion. Still going on, by the way. You know, I just, sorry, I mean, this is economic craziness. And we're not hearing enough about just how crazy it is. So we'll see what happens. I mean, there we are. It's going to be, let me tell you, if we start running deficits of $1.5 trillion, we've got very tough times ahead, in my opinion. And we lose the ability to respond when, in fact, the economy gets soft. Who's next? Yes. Yes, ma'am. Grab that mic, yes, we can hear.
I think the American people would be more than happy to have higher taxes if they got something back from those taxes. If they had health insurance, if they had free education, because the Danes, the Swedes, and Norwegians, and a lot of other people in this world,
even outside of Scandinavia, right? I mean,
taxes, yeah. But look what they get in return.
Yeah.
It's that, and then we have to stop these wars.
Yeah.
They are constantly on.
Yeah.
We have 150 bases all over the world. We have this unbelievable
837 American bases in 150 countries. That's what we got out there. 837, the last count. Maybe it's changed a little bit, but I agree with you. 837 American bases in 150 countries. What are they doing out there? What are we doing out there? Doesn't seem to me it's contributing to world peace and stability and those kinds of things. And a lot of our resources going there. And we're spending $700 billion in the military this year. That can't go for health care and at least low-cost university college education for kids and all the kinds of things that I think most Americans would support. So it's central to our trying to get back on track and achieve some degree of balance between what's going on. Well, but part of the political process ought to be to help people get informed. Yeah, go ahead.
So how would you persuade the government or the people to invest in infrastructure? How do we convince? How do we get more infrastructure? Would you be willing to run a deficit to get more infrastructure, or do you?
Look, I'm a big train man. I don't think that's a secret to any of you. I was the guy that led the fight to kill the so-called master highway plan in metropolitan Boston, which would have paved over the city of Boston. I kid you not. I mean, destroyed the city, in my opinion. It was a long 10-year fight. And then, thanks to a sainted man named Thomas B. O'Neill Jr., who we know as Tip, we managed to change federal law so that all that highway money could go into public transportation if the state or the city wanted it. And we took full advantage of that. And as a result, we invested $3 billion of federal highway dollars in the Boston transit system. Now, it's got some management problems these days. But I think we can agree that Boston's got what at least potentially ought to be the best public transportation system in the country, and it's done wonders for the city of Boston. I mean, Boston today is thriving because we killed that damn highway plan and used the money for something else. When Barack Obama first became president, he recommended and proposed $10 billion a year to go into a national passenger rail system. $10 billion. I mean, that's just a rounding error. The Democratic Congress approved it first year, and it was killed ever since, although there are some Republicans in the Congress who think that the national rail passenger system makes sense. And that's an area where I think we could get some bipartisan agreement. But the money's there, folks, providing we're not throwing it out the window on all this military stuff. 837 American bases in 150 countries. And now we're going to spend $1 trillion to modernize our nuclear arsenal. Doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think we have to raise taxes to do this. I think we have to make some judicious cuts in the military budget and put it into domestic rail, which, by the way, will not be unhelpful from a national security standpoint, among other things. Who's next? Yeah.
To the question of bipartisanship.
Yeah.
You look at a lot of federal races now. Thank you. You look at a lot of federal races now. It's coming down to a question of whether or not government is a good, whether it's doing good for the people or not. A lot of conservatives are running on a platform essentially of let's eviscerate government. The new head of the Federal Consumer Protection Bureau, Mick Mulvaney, has called it an egregious insult to democracy. The head of the Department of Energy proposed getting rid of the Department of Energy when he was running for the Republican nomination for president. And from my experience, people who identify as liberal, progressive, Democrat, however you want to frame it, generally believe government to be a good thing that does good things for the citizens and the country. I'm just wondering how you think you can bridge that divide. You identify a problem that needs a solution. Folks on the left would generally say we can use government to solve that problem. Folks on the right might say generally let's get government out of it, let private industry tackle that. I'm just curious how you think you can bridge that seemingly critical divide.
Yeah, I don't think the argument that government is either too small or too big is particularly convincing people. Ask them whether or not they want to repeal Medicare. What do you think the numbers will look like on that one?
The third rail.
Ask them whether or not they want to go into another great recession and whether or not the government has some responsibility to do something about that. Ask them whether or not they want good schools for their kids and tuitions that are somewhat less than, what does it cost to go to Yale these days? What is it?
Almost 70.
Almost 70. We have a wonderful grandson. We got a flock of grandkids. One of them's just started at Yale. He started at Tufts. $65,000. I paid $1,100 for room, board, and tuition at Swarthmore College in the 50s. Now, there are economists here who can tell you what the inflation factor ought to be, but it didn't go from $1,100 to $65,000, right? Don't ask them whether or not they think government is too big or too small. Ask them whether or not they think these government-sponsored, financed efforts are important to them. Why is it that in so-called red states, and I hope the Democratic Party will stop buying into this red-blue narrative. It's one of the worst things we've ever done. You know, you write off half the country from the beginning. That's nuts. You know, if you ask, and there have been a number of referenda raising the minimum wage in so-called red states. They pass with decisive majorities. How come? Because most of the folks out there that are voting are middle-class Americans, working, trying to support themselves and their families with a decent life. Their incomes haven't gone up much at all. In fact, I think 60% of the American people are making less in real terms today than they were 20 years ago. They're not going to tell you they don't want the government to act. They may be frustrated that the government is not acting in ways that they think it should act. but I don't buy this notion that the vast majority of Americans have a small government or medium-sized government or anything else. I think they're interested in the services that government can provide to make their lives better and the lives of their kids and grandkids better. And if you put it in those terms, I mean, where are they on this tax cut? They're against it. Why? Because it's a rich man's tax cut. And that doesn't help them, and it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense economically either. So I don't think that's the issue. The question is, how do you focus? Now, look, this has not been a good year for the Republican Party. I think we can agree. I mean, they're torn apart. They're at each other's throats, this, that, and the other thing. I don't know what they're going to do if this guy in Alabama gets elected. Are they going to refuse to seat him and so on and so forth? If the Democratic Party doesn't clean their clock in the congressional elections next year, then there's something wrong with us. But it's got to be a 50-state, 185,000 precinct campaign. And I'm serious about this. I'm a huge believer in precinct-based organizing. What does that mean? A precinct captain and 6 block captains in every precinct in the country. Do you think 185,000 precincts in a country with 320 million people, do you think the Democratic Party ought to be able to recruit 185,000 precinct captains? I would hope so. And I don't care what you're talking, what state, red, blue, or otherwise. I mean, you know, this is the kind of thing that this party of mine isn't doing, didn't do. If we had done it, Donald Trump would be history. But we didn't do it. We didn't do it. And I've seen it work so many times. Elizabeth Warren never would have been elected to the United States Senate if she hadn't had a precinct-based organization with a precinct captain in every one of the 2,157 precincts in Massachusetts. And Kitty and I will take a little bit of credit for that because she sat down with us early on, and so she got the Dukakis speech. Right? You got 2,157 precincts, you need 2,157 precinct captains, each will recruit 6 block captains. And their job is to make personal contact on an ongoing basis with every single voting household. She did it. The polls 5 days before the election said the race was tied or Brown was a little ahead. She beat him by 9 percentage points. It was those precinct captains and those block captains. And there's no reason under the sun why we can't do this. And believe me, when you start talking to people on their doorsteps, they're not talking to you about small government or big government. They're talking about problems that they face, that their communities face, and what we ought to be doing about it. It's a very serious problem. Maybe we ought to spend less time trying to educate the world on what democracy is and get serious about democracy in the United States, which is where there are serious efforts, as all of you know, to curb the ability of folks, especially poor folks, minority folks, to vote. And it's serious. And we've now got a Supreme Court of the United States which has handed down, I mean, the Civil Rights Act is unconstitutional. I mean, there are a few lawyers in the room. I used to be one, right? How can a Civil Rights Act passed by the Congress of the United States overwhelmingly with strong bipartisan support after extensive hearings, how can an extension of the Civil Rights Act be unconstitutional? I don't get it. What is this? Now we got a new guy in the Supreme Court. Trust me, he'll be worse than Scalia, my classmate at law school. Gorsuch will be worse than Scalia. I mean, that guy's to the right of Marie Antoinette. I'm serious. Well, that's what happens, you know, when you don't win the presidency. Anyway, I'm sorry to go on at great length. Yeah.
I may.
Great.
Yes, thank you. Going back to building consensus.
Yeah.
You know, during the Obama administrations, we had one law, one major law, and it was passed without a single Republican vote.
Yeah.
It was the Health Care Act. Yeah. 8 years without laws. So the president was forced to use orders and directives to make things work.
Right.
I'm very afraid that we're going to end up in the same situation for at least 4 years now. And my question is, how is it possible to think of a body that works as internal diplomats who bridge the gap between Republicans and Democrats so that we can get consensus, because it's a process, as we all know.
Yeah.
And it's a structured process sometimes.
Yeah.
Is that a wild idea? Can the media play that role? The media is not playing that role. It's playing the
all this stuff.
The partisan role.
Well, actually, there are Republicans and Democrats working on bipartisan issues in the Congress, and a lot of legislation passed in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. It just wasn't health care. It was a lot of stuff, including an infrastructure bill, which passed pretty decisively. And as I say, hold on. Okay. Who's calling? Who's calling, sweetie?
Somebody from the Congressional Committee.
Tell them I've already contributed. I love these guys, but Elizabeth Warren and I forget her name, a quite conservative Republican congresswoman from Tennessee, have just been working on getting people with hearing problems much less expensive hearing aids. Now, 20 years ago, if you said to me, well, that's an important issue, I'd have said, hearing aids? Now that Kitty and I are in our 80s, not only are we having, I find in class these days, I got to move closer to my students. Never had to do that before. Kitty now wears hearing aids. And I don't have to tell you what you pay for hearing aids. Well, there's some new hearing aid that you can get for $300, not $2,000. And the Tennessee Congresswoman and Elizabeth Warren are working hard to do something about that. The guy from Texas, Cornyn, and who's the Democrat? I can't remember. Is it Chris Murphy? Connecticut. No, I know he's from Connecticut, but I'm just wondering. He are working on at least a modest effort to control guns.
Chris Murphy.
Is it Chris?
Yeah.
With John Cornyn? Yeah. Huh?
4-hour filibuster.
Yeah. Really?
Yeah. Registration of the guns.
Let me say this to you folks. My state has the toughest gun laws in the country. And we have the lowest homicide rate in the country. I think they're related. But these things, I mean, there are people in the Congress who are looking at opportunities to find common ground.
The Greek American, Olympia Snow, she was...
Well, Olympia was, but you see, Olympia was one of those moderate Republicans who, was deeply committed to universal health care. Now, for a variety of reasons, I think the Democrats badly mishandled her. She could have been a very decisive vote here in a number of ways, and she wanted to be. And without getting into the details of that, I mean, but she was the kind of person that, I work with great Republicans. I am even today. Bill Weld was my successor. Now, we happen to practice law together. In fact, I supervised him when he was a young associate in my law firm. And he and I are working hard to convince the new governor that we ought to finally connect North and South Station by rail and have a fully integrated regional rail system in not only eastern Massachusetts, but New England. Well's my ally on this. He and I are working on Mass Smoker in North Adams, which is not only a great success, we turned empty factory buildings, the two of us succeeded each other, into a great Museum of Contemporary Art, but now we're talking about turning North Adams into a center for the arts. Seriously. You look for common ground. You look for people that you can work with on this kind of thing. And it is happening, but you're right, we're not hearing much about it in the press, which is covering this daily gong show at the White House, every day. But you have to keep working at that. I mean, I think it's so important that if you're in government that you do that. And I hope we can. Yeah, go ahead.
You were raising a range of important issues like public debts, etc. How do you introduce
long-termism into legislatures and administrations like public debts, Social Security, and problems like this?
With difficulty, but you keep working at it. And trust me, if you set the stage for this, I mean, it took a long time for us to get off this highway thing in Massachusetts, and not only to emphasize public transportation, but to do so in a way which would help revive our older industrial communities, which were in terrible shape when I first was elected in the mid-'70s. We had unemployment rates in the older mill cities, the Lowells, the Haverhills, the New Bedfords, the Fall Rivers, in the 20s. Not anymore. Lowell's one of the great model cities. Why? Well, a couple of Greeks named Dukakis and Tsongos went to work and convinced people that we should invest as $250 million in state money in Lowell. But let me tell you something, Lowell today is a model for an old industrial community that is now revived and is doing exceedingly well. And we're doing, or trying to do that in all of our other older urban communities. Still have work to do. Long range, yeah, but we somehow managed, I think, to convince people that this was an important priority, that government could do it, not by itself, obviously, but that it was an important part of the mix, and in point of fact, those old mill cities are coming back in a remarkable way. By the way, in case you've missed it, cities are coming back. Isn't that amazing? They're coming back. When I first got elected to the legislature, folks, you know, Boston was practically dying. And so were a lot of other cities in Connecticut and elsewhere. You know, the city was racist, it was anti-Semitic, it was divided, it was angry. Boston Harbor was a sewer. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Not these days. With pretty strong, broad, bipartisan support. So there are people in Congress working at this, and one of the things we ought to be doing is trying to encourage them to do so. And I think we can. But it's always, you know, short-term, long-term. Can you convince people that they ought to be working now on things that, it's one of the reasons why infrastructure is so important. There's nothing short-term about infrastructure. And it has a profound effect on how you grow, what, you know, where investment goes and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's critical. If you can convince people that a long-term infrastructure program makes sense and they ought to invest in it, it'll have profound effects. Maybe one or two more questions, then we'll wrap up. Yeah, youth will be served.
Great.
Go ahead.
So you mentioned Heracles, and
yeah.
It made me wonder.
What did he call those Athenians who weren't participating actively in the politics of the community? You remember? Idiotis, which for those of you who don't speak Greek, needless to say, is the root word for idiot. Idiotis was the word he used.
Right.
Anyway.
So one thing that
yeah.
You know, the Athenians broadly really, you know, valued was like the concept of statesmanship, like classically understood, and you know, I think that is very much embodied by your generation. Like, you served in the military, you practiced law, you served in the government, in public service, and it seems like that has been, you know, very much part of the American tradition from Hamilton to Webster to Roosevelt. I think now it's beginning to decline. Like, I mean, I'm not sure Reagan exactly was a statesman, and at this point, like, with Trump, it seems to be like now we're just outright rejecting it, right? With like people like Roy Moore.
I don't agree with you. My students these days are really hopped up about public service, thanks to Donald Trump. No, it's really kind of interesting. I've got kids pouring into my office every day who want to sit down and talk about how they get into public service. I have hundreds. I've been teaching for 27 years. I've got hundreds and hundreds of former students who are out there doing great stuff. One of them just got elected to Congress in California. His name is Jimmy Gomez. Who was Jimmy Gomez? The youngest of 6 in a family of Mexican immigrants who came to the United States illegally in the 1970s, got amnesty under the Reagan amnesty bill, in case people have forgotten this, in 1986. They settled in Riverside, whose mayor, by the way, is also a former student of mine and a terrific mayor, who's now pairing up religious congregations with homeless people. Rusty Bailey is going to have a religious organization adopting every single homeless person in Riverside. This isn't going to cost the city anything. Anyway, back to Gomez. So Gomez ends up in Riverside, almost dies at the age of 6 because they don't have health insurance and they don't get him to the hospital on time. And graduates from high school, was working at Target or something, and somehow took a course at Riverside Community College. He got a B. And somebody said to him, you ought to enroll here. And he did. And then transferred to UCLA. And I get him in the course I teach in California policy issues. There's something about this kid. So I bring him in, have a conversation. I say, you interested in politics? Well, have you ever been in politics? No. Are you interested? Well, I'm kind of interested. Jimmy Gomez graduated Magna from UCLA, went to the Kennedy School and got a master's at Harvard, went back out to Los Angeles, went to work for the unions, went to work for a member of Congress, ran for the Assembly from East Los Angeles, got elected, and in the special election to fill Javier Becerra's vacant seat, who's now the Attorney General, Gomez won by 20 percentage points. Sounds pretty good to me. But you guys have got to get involved. That's the important thing. And I must say to you that in a crazy kind of way, Trump seems to have stimulated enormous interest in at least the kids I'm teaching these days. On both coasts, by the way, in public service. But they need some guidance. They need those of us who have been in the business to take them in hand and say to them, hey, you can do this. You know, it's the most open political system in the world, folks. I mean, what was a Greek kid in the town of Brookline doing running for office? I don't know. You know, I hardly had a big ethnic vote in the town of Brookline, Massachusetts, right? So I ran for town meeting from a precinct, rang every doorbell, stood in front of the polling place for 13 hours and got elected. I mean, that's where it all started. You can do the same. You can do the same. Question?
Speaking of Trump, what do you think of his plan to withdraw from the Paris Agreement? And more generally...
What do I think of his what?
Plan to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, COP21, on climate change. And what can we do as a country to foster...
If I see him, I'm going to tell him to go to Glacier National Park in a hurry because in 10 years there won't be any glaciers there. And I'm going to ask him whether or not he has any conception of what is going on.
But what can we do to foster bipartisanship on the issue in this country?
Well, it's very interesting, and I'll conclude with this. One of the interesting things that's happened is that governors, states, and mayors and local communities, with a lot of help from the former mayor of New York, who happens to be a native of Medford, Massachusetts, whose family couldn't buy a house in Medford, Massachusetts when he was a kid because he was Jewish. They were Jewish. And they had to go through a straw to get the house. That's Mike Bloomberg. Anyway, Bloomberg has an institute now which he's supporting. He's very committed to doing something about climate change. And that institute with Jerry Brown and a number of other governors and mayors have basically said to the world, hey, don't pay any attention to that guy. We hold political office, and we're for the Paris Agreement, and we're going to do everything we can to implement it. Kind of interesting. When was the last time that happened? And by the way, notice that while all of this nonsense is going on in Washington, state and local governments are, for the most part, out there doing their jobs and reflecting, I think, a lot more of the values that are represented in a room like this than are represented in Trump Tower. Meantime, the business is going south, so maybe he'll pay attention to that as well. But, look, coal is gone. I mean, I'm sorry. I won West Virginia by 12 percentage points, and I got a lot of votes from coal miners, but coal is gone, And the private sector is leaving coal. They're not using coal anymore. And this guy in China, whatever you think of his politics, has just announced that they're going to be all electric by 2030, 2040, So I continue to be fairly optimistic, but I share the same feelings most of us have when we wake up in the morning and discover that we got another tweet and it's another crazy something and so on. Anyway, it's been great fun being with you. To the young people particularly, I hope you'll get into this business and get into it seriously and and encourage your fellow Greek Americans. You've got a great heritage and I think a great responsibility, and I hope you'll follow up on that. Thanks.